Hi guys, I'm Orion Fang from History Club. I'm going to be talking about Period 7 today. So Period 7 is the Progressive Era. Some context here. So leading up to the Progressive Era, we had the Gilded Age, which was the rise of trusts and business conglomerates. And you had political machines that controlled voters with rampant corruption. So now we're going to move to the actual content. This is the first section out of 6. The first, the first part, the progressive movement was separated into different types of people. Right, you had the muckrakers, who you had. Please give me a second. All right, so I'm going to restart. Sorry for apologies for the technical issues. Anyways, so the progressive movement was separated into different types and different people who supported it from different levels. The first movement that we're going to talk about, featured right here, is the muckrakers. They are journalists who attempted to expose corruption and social injustice through the redirection of public attention. You have people here like Jacob Riis, who most prominently took pictures of the tenements or the poor people who lived in them, exposing the horrible living conditions. And you also had other people like Ida B. Tarbell, a female journalist who attempted to expose social injustice and racism. Next, we have the idea of social gospel, right? It was a social reform movement revolving around cities, and it was about aiding the poor through both material and spiritual service. And then now we move on to the third part, which is the settlement house movement, right? Settlement houses were a response to the overcrowding of urban slums, and middle-class individuals opened these institutions to help immigrants adapt to industrial Americas within the big cities. This also attempted to better the lives of poor workers in the lower class. And right here, this is a picture of Hull House, one of the many famous settlement houses, right? And then after that, we sort of move forward to municipal reform. Municipal reform was an attempt to reform at the local level and sort of the city slash local county area district, right? That reform attempted to change the local government and committee to establish more progressive leaders and members, politicians that weren't exactly that, the politicians that supported the leaders, the people more so than the corrupt business people. So some of the measures that they introduced to combat party machines through municipal reform were the secret ballot, right? It's one of the first major progressive reforms. This is something that you may want to write down for your DBQ. The secret ballot basically ensured anonymity, and it took away part of the political machine power because it made sure that even if you voted no on something the party machine wanted you to vote yes on, you couldn't be harmed because they wouldn't be able to tell who voted no. this also split the ticket, which means you could vote separately on issues, and not just yes or no on one whole big list of issues that you wanted to talk about. Another aspect of municipal reform was the strong progressive mayor. This basically gave the mayor a bunch of excess unilateral power, which is extra power, and then they got that one man elected, and he used that tremendous power to advance reforms for the people, because it was way easier for people to elect that one person and then pile power onto that one position for that person to use, rather than work long and hard to elect numerous members onto a city council, which might not even work. In any case, that was municipal reform. Now we move down to Statehouse Reform. Statehouse Reform was more, on the state level. It changed the state legislature. Two of the most famous movements we see in the state level was the initiative and the referendum movements. So for the initiative movement, citizens could bypass the state legislature and they put legislation on the state government and the state ballot without the legislature approval, which means that corrupt business politicians in the state houses could not strike down these bills, and they could just be directly bypassed, and then the citizens would actually get to vote on what they wanted to see and vote on. The referendum action was when the legislature passes a law, the people could vote whether to keep or to get rid of the law, ensuring that no unjust laws could be directly passed without the people approval. Another action was the recall action, which was designed to affect corrupt politicians. If a certain percentage of people thought someone was unfit to serve, say this corrupt politician who was working for the trusts or the political machines, they could vote to recall, or basically retire the person in office. And this also, another action was the direct primary, which meant that people in the party voted for the candidate to replace and represent the party, instead of having everyone else everyone else in the party leaders, so to speak. Instead of having the party leaders decide who runs or attempts to run for the position, the people of the party would decide. So some famous examples, you see this guy here is Robert Lafayette of Wisconsin. He was a famous Wisconsin governor who was very famous for taking a very strong stance on reforms. And he was sometimes very uncompromising, and this led to a lot of reforms within his state. This man here is Governor Hiram Johnson of California, and one of the things he did was as a governor of the Progressive period, he attempted to limit the power of large trusts such as the Southern Pacific Railway Company. Right, the progressive movement eventually. Sorry. Apologies. The progressive movement eventually rose to the presidential level, right? You see here the man known as Theodore Roosevelt, Trustbuster Theodore Roosevelt. He came to power after McKinley was assassinated, and he supported trust regulation through publicized efforts, and he put labor workers into consideration. He also pushed for conservation of nature and preservation within the Square Deal, which is related to progressive legislation, right? And he was overall a very progressive president, and who had the support of the people. He believed in the idea of regulating or breaking up bad trusts, right? Trusts that got too large or became too greedy. But he believed also in keeping good trusts that were good for the economy. After Roosevelt came his successor, William Howard Taft, or as some people like to know him as, Bill Taft, right? William Howard Taft was a progressive at first, but he began to sympathize and sort of side with the conservatives. He was a very moderate sort of president, and eventually, when Roosevelt returned from Africa in 1912, he and Taft attempted to run for the same presidential position, or the presidential candidate position, as members of the Republican Party. This eventually split the party, and Roosevelt left the party because the party nominated Taft to run for president, and the Roosevelt started his own political party called the Bull Moose Party, but neither of the party got enough of the vote to win the presidency. And for the first time in a long, long time, the Democrats won because of their man Woodrow Wilson. He utilized Democratic majorities to pass bills, as seen here, this man right here. And he some of the amendments, some of the many things that happened under his administration were the 16th to 19th Amendments. The most important of these four amendments were the 18th and the 19th Amendments, right? So basically, the 18th Amendment was the amendment passed by the temperance movement. Temperance was a social reform movement that attempted to ban alcohol because alcohol was an evil that spawned violence and laziness. And the 18th Amendment banned alcoholic drinks and attempted to shut down places that would provide alcohol in a way because it would take away their business. And so you can see that here, the wet and dry, right? That's a political poster. It's attempting to highlight the difference. Voting wet would mean voting for corrupt politicians and the supporting political party machine power, and voting dry would help support women and children at home, right? The other very important amendment that passed under Wilson's administration was the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote, right? The women's suffrage movement, which we'll talk about here, was very important. So for women, especially middle-class women, reform became an important part of their lives. It originally started with clubs. So these clubs were originally focused on cultural activities, but they eventually transitioned to societal improvement, right? And even though, ironically, these clubs that were focused on societal improvement, they were still racially segregated, which is, a healthy dose of irony right there. And women's suffrage was based on natural rights, an argument that women deserve the same rights as men. So this idea started in 1910 and it eventually ended in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So you have here a women's suffrage movement, and you have here the silver dollar coin of Susan B. Anthony, who was a famous reform women's suffrage figure. Now we're moving on to the next section, Imperialism, World War, and beyond. So here's some context. So McKinley presided over the Spanish-American War. That gave us control over Cuba, the Philippines, and so on. And that was new land, and we were able to gain a foothold in the Pacific. There was also the Monroe Doctrine from 100 years ago, which stated that basically we had to protect the whole hemisphere. We were like the policeman of the Western Hemisphere, and we wouldn't interfere in the other side, with Europe, and they wouldn't interfere with us. So our three progressive presidents, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, they had similar and yet very different types of diplomacy. Roosevelt's diplomacy was to use your vocal organs to emit sound as silently as possible and have with you at all times attached to your persons a stick of indeterminately large size. In other words, speak softly and carry a big stick. That's known as the big stick diplomacy. Roosevelt believed in civilized versus non-civilized nations, which was based on technology, not race. Thus, Japan was made an exception to the non-civilized versus civilized nations because of their technology. And Roosevelt even added a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is appropriately named the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And he attempted to keep the open door policy in Asia, which meant that all countries could have free access, to Asia / China / Chinese resources and whatnot. And he also opened the Panama Canal, and he fostered American interest in Latin America. William Howard Taft believed in dollar diplomacy. He didn't so much use military power as economic power. He extended Americans' investments into less developed regions, most notably Latin America and the Caribbean, by using money more to pressure them more so than the military, because he believed, he was more moderate as a president. He did not believe in the use of military force so much as Roosevelt did. And finally, we have Woodrow Wilson. He used moral diplomacy. And one of the many things that happened during his time was the stabilization and recognition of Mexico. So Mexico was undergoing civil war. because of different rulers who wanted to rise up. You had some people before called General Horta, and he eventually got taken down. And then Wilson supported someone else, and then he finally decided to recognize the Carranza regime. And after that, well, he stopped focusing so much on Mexico because of one reason: World War One. So we're gonna move right here. So World War One. So originally America was neutral, right? However, the idea of profit to America was always, very, very clear. By selling weapons to the Allies, American-made weapons, America would definitely benefit a lot from that. And so America did, and it became known as the arsenal of democracy. This created an economic boom in America. And also, America also began eventually siding against the Germans, in particular because of the Germans' policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, which was to shoot down, sink any ships that were holding Allied goods or resources. There are two big events in particular. One of them is seen here, the San Francisco Chronicle. Hundreds perish when the Lusitania is torpedoed. The sinking of the Lusitania elicited rage among Americans because while the Germans maintained that, the Lusitania was secretly carrying British military supplies, American people were on the ship, and this is what outraged many, many Americans. This began to turn public opinion. Not only that, the second event, known as the Zimmermann Telegram. What happened was Germany attempted to send a telegram to Mexico in order to ask Mexico to declare war on America. That way, when Germany eventually won, they would give Mexico the parts of America that America had taken from them previously, right? However, British people intercepted this telegram midway, deciphered it, and then proceeded to happily send it to the Americans, who were very, very furious. And that's how America entered World War One. America in the Great War. So, for Americans, this kind of ties into most, if not all of it, but America sent soldiers over, lots of people signed up. The American Expeditionary Force was very prominent. And with the aid of America, the Allies finally won strategically, right? So everyone pretty much knows the story. I don't feel like there's a need for me to go into super in-depth military exploits. America's participation in World War was really more of a final nail in the nail in the coffin for Germany, rather than, the start of a comeback of sorts. What we must focus on is America's society and economy during World War One. So the economy in wartime. So the war was paid for through bonds and increased taxes, right? So primarily, America mostly sold tons of war bonds. And I'm sure we've explained the motion of bonds, but I'll explain it again. War bonds are basically this slip of paper that the American government gives you. You buy it from the American government. So say there's a $50 war bond. You buy that for $50. America takes these $50 and Uncle Sam uses it for the war effort. And then after that, after a certain amount of time, America will pay you back what the bond's value was set. So say you bought this $50 war bond for $25. Uncle Sam takes these $25, he puts them into the war effort. Then maybe 20 years after, the bond value is now $50 after the country's economy has recovered. So Uncle Sam will gladly give you back your $50. That's the basics of how a war bond works. And so that was how America managed to pay for the war. But the relegation of supplies was left to the War Industries Board. So that was created to manage resources and purchase supplies. And even though America likes to claim that the War Industries Board was extremely efficient, without mistakes, it was actually rather carried by the vast amount of resources that America had to begin with. And the War Industries Board was sort of inefficient in a way because of mistakes in coordination and a difference in specs and etc. However, regardless, the War Industries Board managed to pull through and give America the necessary amount of military supplies. There was a great increase in general production for the war effort, of course. And in essence, that was the economy during wartime. American culture and society during wartime. So so most of America was rather admittedly racist towards German Americans. Remember the temperance movement? The temperance movement was about prohibition, the banning of alcohol. Now, mostly everyone did not accept this early on because alcohol was such an important key part of our daily lives. But during World War One, many people began actively supporting temperance because most of the brewers were German Americans. So this helped further the temperance movement, but it also showed sort of how ridiculous the racism against Germans or the German Americans were getting. There was even a point in time where German books were banned and German sauerkraut is this German like pickled food, became renowned as Liberty cabbage, which is, you know, ridiculous. In any case, that was most American culture. And America even passed acts of sedition to silence those in the peace movement. And the peace movement was composed of many different people. But most importantly, what happened is that the peace movement had German Americans, Irish Americans, socialists, the international workers of the world, pacifists, religious pacifists like Quakers and etc. And most importantly, the women's movement, which divided after America entered the war. Half of the women's movement wanted the support of most Americans, the majority. So as a result, what they did was that they supported the war. That gave the majority the right to support them. The other half of the women's movement attempted to support fighting against the war, right? That side began to attract lots of ire and hate as a result from the majority of Americans. So the American government, on the other hand, attempted to suppress dissent, right? Although there were outbursts of patriotism, minorities who protested were subtly targeted by the government, who directed patriots against them. And it also even enacted measures to prosecute anti-war activists. But the majority of the work really came from the public. I've said before that, sauerkraut was renamed to Liberty Cabbage. Brewers were, the temperance movement was supported in order to stop the German American community brewers. But not only that, lynchings and harassment occurred as well. That was what happened for American culture and society. You had outbursts of patriotism, you had racism, you had a peace movement that was largely suppressed by the American government. And now we move on to what happened after the war. So after the war, many things happened. Woodrow Wilson believed that after this war, it was the war to end all wars, that after this conflict, crisis should be averted by instead forming an international group of nations that would be the policemen of the world. Sort of like the United Nations, except for, not the United Nations, and a lot weaker and with little to no power, etc. That idea was called the League of Nations, and their flag is demonstrated right here. The League of Nations, Société des Nations, right? Then there were the 14 points, right? A list of 14 points that Wilson wanted to present at the Paris Peace Conference in order to in order to ensure world peace and etc. What happened after the war as well was the Red Scare. So Russia withdrew in the middle of World War I because of a communist revolution, as I'm sure everyone knows from their previous world history class. However, this sparked much fear in the hearts of Americans. The socialists and the international workers of the world were part of the peace movement, as I've said earlier. So there began to be, outbursts against them. People prosecuted them. They were scared of what was to come next. As you see here in this cartoon, strikes and walkouts. Then what would happen, everyone assumed, would be disorder and riots. And then Bolshevism, which is communism, and murders, and then finally chaos. And that was the Red Scare for many because they did not want to fall into chaos. They did not want America to destabilize. And so they attempted to actively root out communists and socialists. Some key takeaways from this section are the three diplomacies, of course, the big stick, dollar, and moral diplomacies, the idea of the civilized versus the uncivilized nations, and finally, the idea of Western Hemisphere hegemony. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is one of the most important things that you might need to keep in mind for your DBQ, because if we're talking, say, about American imperialism, that's a must-have. You must it's probably good for you to talk about it. The next section, the Roaring Twenties. So for the Roaring Twenties, this is after World War I. America has, in essence, sort of retreated from the world after Wilson's 14 points didn't pass and America didn't really join the League of Nations. And Wilson himself, even though he attempted to support it, he caught a stroke or two and ended up not being able to support it for the rest of his presidency, in a sense. And so America began to gradually retreat from the world. The Roaring Twenties was a period of economic stability in America, and America became the greatest world power because most of the European powers were tired out and they were in debt to, you guessed it, America, who was providing money for them, right, to pay off their debts. Right? So technological, economic, labor, and agriculture in the new era. There were many technological advancements during this time, most notably the advent of radio technology, right? Radio technology became more widespread for mostly everyone. The economic boom lasted from 1920 to 1929, except for a small decline in 1923, which was quickly rectified. There was the development of consumerism and credit mechanisms, as well as a mass consumer culture, and it became acceptable to put oneself in debt to acquire items of utility and pleasure. So not necessarily items that you needed anymore, so much as items that you were expected to have by society. And people were willing to put themselves in debt for that, which was a different type of culture. Moving on. So within the 20s culture, there was a changing position for women in society. You have the emergence of the flapper culture, as you see here, which was a new type of women and how women defined themselves in society. You had cultural revolutions like the Harlem Renaissance. And then you also had cultural conflicts. You had the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, the return of the KKK, so to speak. This is its second iteration, right? And you had the conflicts over prohibition, because prohibition and temperance, to the fact, the 18th Amendment, it mostly failed. What happened was prohibition efforts were underfunded, undermanned, and mostly undersupported. There were very little amounts of agents, and half the time the public did not support any of these efforts. This eventually led to the battles of prohibition, so to speak. Bootlegging alcohol. That's what it basically was. Alcohol bootleggers would eventually be able to form gangs because they sold the alcohol, because of the high value that alcoholic drinks had, because they were illegally banned, which was the problem with banning things in America. The more it's banned, the more the people want it, which, reverse psychology. So over here you have a picture of people dumping alcohol into the sewer drain, and over here you have a mugshot of gang in the beer wars. The beer wars were this conflict in Chicago during the Roaring Twenties between Al Capone and other gangs who were trying to take control of Chicago and increase their beer industry or their moonshine industry. During the Roaring Twenties, there were two prominent presidents, Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. These two presidents mostly did little to nothing. They were conservative presidents. They believed in, keeping things more as it were than attempting to change them. And reform was little or nothing. Some important concepts and key takeaways from the Roaring Twenties were the ideas of consumerism and credit mechanisms, the technology boom, and the failure of prohibition. The next section, the Great Depression and the New Deal. That's where everything comes crashing down. The economic boom lasted from 1920 to 1929. Then, on one tragic day known as Black Tuesday, Wall Street stocks took a big crash. They didn't really recover. Well, their value recovered, but the people's confidence, not so much. What happened was that banks got greedy. The banks were playing with stocks on Wall Street, public banks, and they were taking the money of the people and putting it out on Wall Street. And they also, not only that, they overextended their values by putting out too many loans. Stocks also became overvalued during this time as a result. And finally, nail in the coffin, farmers were producing too much. So Black Tuesday, the stock market crash. After that, banks began failing after public confidence was lost, and many people began making runs on banks. Basically, what would happen is people would go to that bank, and what would happen is they'd ask to retract all of their money. All the savings they ever put into that bank, they're taking all of it out. What happened? And then so the banks are, of course, they only have a limited amount of specie, right, or cash or currency within their vault. So they'll take as much as the person wants and they give it to them. The person leaves. But remember, the banks put out too many loans. They loaned out too much money to the people who were using this bank. So what happens when the bank's vault is empty and there's still a line of people outside trying to take back their savings? The bank collapses. And that happened to so many banks. Public confidence in banks tanked all the way down to basically zero. The bad banks were getting destroyed. The good banks were also getting destroyed because people were not sure which of the banks were good, which of the banks were bad. So they made runs on all the banks that they knew they had their money in, and most of the banks were destroyed. Now we talk about the debt cycle, which is also important. So the debt cycle was basically this financial system for countering the debts that Britain and France and the Allies incurred during World War I, because America loaned out money to them. Britain and France owe money to the US now. However, Germany owes money to Britain and France. So what happened was America loans money to Germany. Germany takes that money, they pay it off to the Allies. The Allies take that money, they pay it off to the US. The US takes that same amount of money and they give it to Germany. And the cycle continues, as you see here. Right? So, as a result, that same cycle of cash that's cycling forever stops during the Great Depression because America can't afford to hand out that wad of cash anymore. So Germany stops paying its debts. That as a result, the Allies can't pay their debts, and now you have economic disaster. And not only that, the Allies petitioned the U.S. to please forgive their debts, but the guy who was running this show, by the way, Herbert Hoover, he refused to forgive the debts. He refused to drop the debts as they were, and so the international economy was basically ruined. Germany fell into a deep depression. The value of Germany's money dropped to zero, basically zero. So now we talk about more effects of the Great Depression. This dropping, the banks had to, so this eventually led to the economic downward spiral, and this led to great amount of unemployment. So this is a chart of unemployment in the Great Depression. You can see 1929 to basically right before Black Thursday. There's a big spike and it keeps on rising. all the way up to here, 1933. Millions were unemployed. And relief efforts. The Hoover administration had little to no relief efforts. They were mostly ineffective. The most relief any person could find within the Great Depression was in soup kitchens and bread lines. A soup kitchen and a bread line, as seen here, who would provide food to poor people who couldn't afford to eat for themselves. During this time as well, unemployed men fled their families because of their shame that they were unable to provide a living for their family. Another thing of the Dust Bowl was overproduction. Well, another thing of the Great Depression was the Dust Bowl. So the overproduction of farmers was already bad. Now you have the Dust Bowl, which was what happened when the soil became dried up. The farmers had been using that same soil for years and years, and they took away all the nutrients in that soil, which made it dry and crumbly like dust. And then winds came and they blew that dust away, and that's why you had that the saying, the Dust Bowl. And this basically decimated the Midwest, and it forced a lot of farmers to migrate out of their homes. And finally, after Hoover's ineffective relief efforts and his administration, someone came in to save the day, and that person was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR was elected, and he began this new package of policies that we now today know as the New Deal. The first thing that he did was the bank holiday. Basically, he shut down all the banks. FDR didn't let anyone make a run on the bank. This effectively stops runs on the banks, which means that the banks can finally have a chance to recover. Not only that, the bank holiday was designed so that FDR and his administration could kind of sort out through the banks and decide if this bank was bad. And if this bank was bad, they'd shut it down, they'd confiscate the money if it still had any left. And that bank would never reopen again. And this effectively restored public confidence because FDR, because of the bank holiday, this restored public confidence in the banks. And it stopped the banks from getting shut down, and it stopped what could have been the end of the American economy, in essence. The New Deal. So, you have two cartoons here. So the first one is of FDR as a doctor. So on his hat it says F Doctor, treating a disease Uncle Sam. And you see all these pills here. And most of these pills are talking about his actually all of these bottles are talking about his policies. The NRA, the CCC, the CWA, the FACA, the AAA, etc. Many of these policies that FDR implemented were attempts for agricultural adjustment to prevent the farmer overproduction, public works, so that would stop unemployment. So some of these famous, some of the most famous acts that you guys should probably write down were the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. This provided farmers with subsidies for unsold crops to stop overproduction. Basically, the farmers were getting paid to not grow crops. As a result, this would drive down supply and raise demand. Because of the overproduction, demand for the crops were very low. However, by paying the farmers to not produce crops, that would drop the supply, and eventually demand would rise, letting farmers get paid again. Another thing that you guys should probably write down is the Industrial Recovery Act, the IRA, right? This created the National Recovery Association, the NRA, which is different from the NRA we have today. It set a minimum wage and a maximum work week. It stopped child labor and working kids. And finally, it established price floors to allow for established price floors to stop prices from dropping, right? And it allowed for collective bargaining in unions. It also added the PWA, the Public Works Administration, which injected $3 billion in public works for dams, bridges, etc. The famous Hoover Dam that everyone knows about was a result of the Public Works Administration, right? Another important thing that FDR did was that he modified the gold standard. So let me explain. So by lowering the value of gold, he expanded the currency supply. So basically, he manipulated the standard of gold. Say that we have $1 worth of gold here, right? Now say that that's right, and then so the value of the American dollar is equal to an ounce of gold. Now, by changing the value of the gold or the dollar, by changing the value of the dollar, FDR could in effect make more money. Yes, this would lead to inflation, but this also allowed FDR to get a larger budget, so to speak, right? So some other things that FDR did for the New Deal, right? For federal relief, he had FERA, F-E-R-A, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. It provided cash grants to states to prop up relief agencies. These were federal cash grants, and it was a token effort, of course, because you couldn't really save everyone, but it still eased suffering to some extent. There was the Civil Works Administration, the CWA, which granted $4 million to work building roads, schools, and parks, right? Fun fact, the Warm Springs Elementary that a lot of people in Irvington went to, that was an effect of the CWA. It was built in 1936. For mortgage relief, right, you had the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC. This refinanced mortgages of over 1 million households. And then that was the first New Deal. Then after that, FDR added the second New Deal. It was more regulation and watershed programs, but so some of these things were the Social Security Act and the Works Progress Administration. The Social Security Act was a pension system. It's the Social Security that everyone knows today. At the age of 65, people can dip into this large collected fund to use it. This was also could be used for the unemployment or disability insurance. This established unemployment and disability insurance. The federal government would give you 1 year to dip out of this fund. And then so you could kind of support yourself for 1 year. You still got a crutch to support yourself on for 1 year. And then after that, the Works Progress Administration. This replaced the PWA, the Public Works Administration, because the Public Works Administration was struck down by the Supreme Court. The WPA allowed 2.1 million people to work, renovating public buildings, schools, post offices. It built 600 airports, 500,000 miles of roads, and 100,000 bridges, etc. Now we're going to talk about the Supreme Court, which was somewhat important during the New Deal. What FDR did was that he passed so many policies because he knew that the Supreme Court couldn't strike these policies down fast enough, then he could pass them. He'd pass one policy for 1 to 2 years, the Supreme Court would strike that down. He'd get a similar policy with a different name for another 2 to 3 years, which would basically work. However, there came a point in time where the Supreme Court struck down enough policies that FDR threatened to pack the courts. Basically, the Supreme Court has 9 people. FDR threatened to add 5 more people, all people who supported him, basically, all Democratic candidates. And as a result, he would make the Supreme Court more balanced on his side. Yes, the bill was struck down, but the threat was there, and the Supreme Court eventually complied. After the New Deal helped, now we're going to kind of turn back to the past, the Roaring Twenties to World War I, foreign affairs. So, the failure of the League. So, even though America came up with, or Woodrow Wilson in particular, even though Woodrow Wilson came up with the idea of the League of Nations, America didn't actually join. As a result, the League had little to no power whatsoever, because it didn't really have military power to enforce anything that it wanted to do. Right? Failure of the League. So things like Italy invading Ethiopia. Sure, the League could prosecute Italy. Italy just left the League, which meant that the League didn't have any military power to enforce what it wanted Italy to do. This also happened with Japan. Japan simply left the League after they attempted to prosecute it for invading Manchuria or something similar. And the League held little power because the idea of an international organization without military power was meaningless. And since America didn't join the League, it couldn't provide military power whatsoever. Harding and Coolidge's administrations. So Harding and Coolidge did attempt to do something about military power. They attempted to limit or reduce it. So one of the most famous ones, or during their administration, was the Five Power Pact. This limited naval tonnage and set ratios for naval tonnage, which was basically ships or amount of ships. For every 5 tons of United States or British warships, Japan would have 3 tons, and Italy 1.75 tons. Right? They also set a ratio of armaments. There's the 9 Power Pact, which was the continuation of the open door policy in China. And there's the 4 Power Pact, which was the United States, Britain, France, and Japan respect Pacific territories of another in order to prevent aggression and war. And another pact that was passed was the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. This outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. It wasn't really enforced by real means, but rather by world opinion and moral forces, which everyone believed would be enough to keep aggressors in check. Well, they are sadly mistaken, but regardless. Herbert Hoover. He presided over the Great Depression. He also presided over some of the rather controversial policies in American foreign policy. First off, Hoover repudiated the Roosevelt Corollary in 1931. He didn't allow American intervention in Latin America after they defaulted. He also refused to call off cancel all war debts from Europe, so the Europeans defaulted on their debts as well. And most famously, you see this map here. This is a map of China. The red area highlighted here is an area known as Manchuria in 1931. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, and Hoover stopped the Secretary of War Stimson from cooperating with the League of Nations in solving the crisis. The only thing he did was that he refused to grant diplomatic recognition to Japan, but that didn't really count for much because Japan did not care. Japan would just keep on invading Manchuria. So after Hoover came FDR. So FDR did a multitude of foreign policy things that are, we'd say, rather controversial, or not really. So FDR, first off, his bombshell, 1933. He rejected all agreements on a currency stabilization since he had already manipulated the value of the gold in the United States already. So everyone wanted to peg this like a certain amount of currency to the price of gold, but FDR said no because he was manipulating the value of the currency in order to get more money, as I've spoken before. He also ended the post-war debts by completely ignoring what happened and preventing banks from loaning money to stop the circular cycle of money. So by pretending that the debts never existed, the debts were so-called stopped because everyone just ignored them entirely, right? And he also prevented the debts from restarting by stopping all banks from loaning money to Germany or to the Allies. Another thing he did was he recognized the legitimacy of the Soviet regime in 1933. Basically, at that time, the administration wanted to trade with the Soviet Union. So they made a deal. The Soviet Union would stop propaganda, and the U.S. would begin diplomatic recognition of the Soviet Union. In Latin America, he established the good neighbor policy. He abandoned using military influence and instead used economic pressure. Now we have the Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937. So, in 1935 and 1936, there was a mandatory arms embargo against warring countries, and a presidential warning if you wanted to leave the country. In 1936, there was a renewal of the exact same act as the previous year. The Neutrality Act of 1937 was basically the same thing, except for it allowed cash and carry, the cash and carry policy. So basically, the militants could purchase non-military goods with cash and use their own warships to carry. That way, America could still be neutral. It could be selling things, but their warships wouldn't get sunk, so that wouldn't promote, social outcries of war like it did in World War I when the Lusitania got sunk. And it also didn't, and they were also paid on time, right? Because if the warring country lost, they weren't going to pay. So that's the three neutrality acts, which are definitely important for DBQ if we were talking about the American foreign policy. And then we have the Munich Conference. Over here we have three very prominent people. We have Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Britain, basically. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Germany, and Benito Mussolini, the leader of Italy. And then here's the American ambassador to the Munich Conference. I'm sure everyone knows the story. Hitler wanted Czechoslovakia, right? Everyone decided to meet up and discuss these terms. And there was the policy known as appeasement, right? Appeasement was basically about giving the person what they wanted so they would stop asking you. In essence, if a kid asks you for candy and you say no and he keeps on begging you, you give him the candy so you won't ask you again for candy in the future. This doesn't work, but everyone thought it would at a time, so yeah. So basically, in the end, they ended up giving Germany Czechoslovakia, and Hitler promised to stop invading other places. Of course, he lied, and that's why we have World War II. But, yeah. So, abandoning neutrality. In 1939, September 1st, Hitler invaded Poland. Britain and France immediately declared war on Poland because, they promised to defend Poland. And America, of course, instantly declared neutrality because they were not in the mood to get into a war. Right? So, however, they passed a new Neutrality Act of 1939. So, the Neutrality Act of 1939 allowed the cash and carry policy for armaments as well. So, weapons and food. So, weapons, most importantly, and food. It's still the cash and carry policy, but with weapons as well. And FDR secretly supported the war effort, but he told everyone to maintain neutrality, right? But he still really wanted to support Britain because at that point France was defeated, and Britain was the only one still fighting against two countries at once, Italy and Germany. So FDR did a destroyers for bases. Basically, America would give Winston Churchill 50 American destroyers from World War I. In exchange, Britain would give America the right to build American naval bases in British territory in the Pacific, basically letting America have further expansion in the Pacific. Later on in 1940, things began to change. FDR began to publicly, legally abandon neutrality. He had the Lend-Lease Act. So America could lend or lease equipment to allies because at this point Britain was running out of money. It couldn't use the cash and carry policy anymore. So America just straight up started lending weapons to Britain. Hemispheric defense. The United States would defend the hemisphere of their side, basically half of the Atlantic Ocean, but American battleships basically patrolled the entire Atlantic Ocean at this point. And finally, the Atlantic Charter, of which you see here. FDR and Winston Churchill met secretly aboard a submarine, or a ship, not a submarine, my bad. And it was basically an alliance and war between Britain and America, and a declaration that the war must end with the destruction of Nazi Germany, and a new set of ideals to guide reconstruction of Europe after the war. Right? And finally, entrance into World War II. Now we talk about Japan. Japan has been rather aggressive. You saw back there with the invasion of Manchuria. America did basically nothing. What happened after that was Japanese aggression increased. So the United States attempted to suppress or stop Japan through economic means first. First, they canceled a commercial charter, right? The Japanese basically ignored this, but they attempted continued aggression. And then the US froze Japanese assets and cut off trade completely from Japan, denying the Japanese of important supplies. At this point, Japan decides to attack America. And what happened was they initiated the infamous Pearl Harbor attack, one of the most devastating attacks on American soil. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese sent in their planes and they bombed Pearl Harbor. They destroyed 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 4 other ships. 188 aircraft were destroyed, and there were over 3,000 U.S. casualties. As a result, the United States declared war on Japan. Germany declared war on the United States because Japan was its ally, and then in response, the United States declared war on Germany. That moves us into World War II. Right? So, World War II. I'm going to take a drink of water here. All right, World War II. We're going to start with the military side of things. The Pacific Theater. So, first off, there were 2 theaters of war that America participated in. First was the Pacific Theater. America basically fought that one by itself. So there were 2 strategies over here. As you see here, blue is basically territory occupied by Japan, and red is basically basically anti-Japanese territory. The Soviet Union up here, China, India, and these pale countries are neutral, right? So America's attack plan was twofold. So from Australia, General MacArthur would send troops upwards from Australia northwards and hop across the the islands. This was known as island hopping. From Hawaii, Admiral Chester Nimitz would use his ships and attack strategic Japanese positions, and eventually conquer Japan and get to the Japanese mainland. In Europe, well, also Africa as well. So in Europe and Africa, America first assisted in Operation Torch, which was basically an operation to reconquer Africa, northern Africa. Germany controlled portions of northern Africa. After that, they were they wanted to do a naval invasion of France in order to free Paris. But instead, they decided to attack Italy first, so that they could knock Italy out of the fight. So they invaded Sicily, and then they invaded Italy. Then they defeated Mussolini. Italy surrendered, but Germany sent in troops to help defend Italy. And finally, they sent in the troops from across the United Kingdom to France. The infamous D-Day invasion. After that, it's a done deal. They took over Paris within a month. Germany was routed. Eventually, Soviet troops and American/Allied troops met in Berlin. Or they met in Germany, not Berlin, but they split Berlin. And the war was over after Germany surrendered. The national economy during the my bad. There's one more thing I forgot to add. During the war, there was an infamous genocide known as the Holocaust. During this time, while the United States was invading Europe, they rejected entreaties to help Jewish victims because they believed that the greatest way to help these U.S. victims was to quickly finish the war as soon as possible. They also argued that it was strategically disadvantageous to attack like railroads and concentration camps when instead they could be attacking other like major locations such as major cities or forts or um, ports, etc. Forts and ports, etc. So in the end, it's a very controversial choice, but that's what happened. So that's you. It's hard to say whether they could have prevented more casualties or not. But in either case, the United States rejected entreaties to help Jewish victims. Now we turn to the national economy. So World War II basically lifted America out of the Great Depression. It increased federal spending by a lot. Personal incomes increased, and there was a shortage of goods, right? The shortage of goods led to people saving or rationing them. So you only got a set amount of food each week. So these are like food stamps, except for, well, basically they're food stamps, right? There was also withholding of payroll deductions. There was an increase in the income tax, and everyone attempted to develop the Pacific coast because they were fighting with Japan. During the war, there was a boost in union membership. Civilian workforces increased, but there were limits on union powers. Right? In terms of technology, America had the National Defense Research Committee. They developed radar and sonar tech. And there was also new anti-air technology being developed. There were anti-mine technologies. There were quadruple-engine bombers, such as the infamous B-17, also known as the Flying Coffin. Decryption technology, which allowed America to crack the Japanese code, and most infamously, the atomic bomb. So, the effect of the war on the populace. Over here, you have a picture of Rosie the Riveter, a famous, famous mascot of women's rights. The war affected women in a way it never really had before. It allowed for women to move into roles they traditionally never really had. Women in the workforce increased by 60%. A majority of women were in the service sector. They were clerks, secretaries, typists, etc. But sometimes women were in the military, which was usually clerical work. For children, they were usually left at home because the women were at work now. These children were known sometimes as latchkey children or 8-hour orphans. And during this time, the juvenile crime rate rose a lot. For other peoples, for African Americans, they established the Fair Employment Practices Commission, the FEPC, for discrimination. There was a larger migration to northern cities, and armed forces increased the amount of black servicemen. And for Native Americans, 25,000 of them served in the military. They were usually code talkers or combat, and youth on the Native American reservations were left to work in the war plant. For Mexican Americans, larger numbers of them entered the United States due to labor shortages, as mentioned previously, from the United States fighting the war. There were a significant amount of factory jobs that were open, but the migration of Mexican Americans eventually led to rising tensions and sometimes even conflicts, such as the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles. For Chinese Americans, World War II was a big boon for them, in a sense. Their legal and social statuses were enhanced. The Exclusion Acts were repealed to allow migration because there was declined racial animosity because everyone wanted the United States wanted to set the Chinese Americans apart from the Japanese Americans, right? Because the Chinese were fighting with the United States while the Japanese were fighting against them. So there was a more positive image to contrast with the Japanese. And the Chinese also worked in war plants, and 22% of all Chinese males were drafted. For Japanese Americans, they were interned. So the Japanese were racially discriminated. There were accusations of sabotage that were false. The Japanese there was an authority created, the WRA, the War Relocation Authority, created to help Japanese Americans move to internment camps, basically Japanese concentration camps without the executions. And for the Japanese Americans, they lost most of their property, if not all of it, because they were forced to move up and move without being able to do anything. They left most of their property, and everyone else came in and took it, and they couldn't get it back once they returned. And there's a famous court case here, the Supreme Court case, Korematsu versus the United States, which was talking about the constitutionality of the Japanese internment. The Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional. That's something that you might want to keep for the DBQ. The Supreme Court ruled that this internment of Japanese Americans was constitutional. And after the war, when the Japanese Americans returned, they faced harassment and persecution, and they did not receive reparations until 1988. And even then, it was only a token effort. Moving on, finally, wartime life and culture. The shortage of goods for Americans, there was a shortage of goods and also manpower, but there was an increase in entertainment for movies, magazines, and radio. And entertainment places were often packed, dance halls, hotels, and casinos. And the advertisers and the government attempted to tell Americans to believe in the comforts of home in order to raise morale, not only at home, but on the front lines as well. So some of the concepts of World War II were that increased federal spending, and that due to the idea of savings, America was able to enter an economical boom after the war. It also led to explosive increases in technology, such as the atomic bomb and radar and sonar improvements. And finally, it also took away the human rights of the Japanese Americans. That will be all. I will give 5 minutes for anyone who wants to talk about Q&A, I guess. Does anyone have questions? I suppose not. I will be ending the stream now. Thanks for watching.